This video has been brought to you by the generous support of Ground News. Also, if you're interested in the topics I cover here monthly, please check out the program podcast I do with fellow creators Hakeem and JT. It has grown into a behemoth with almost 10,000 4.9-star reviews on Spotify and comes out 5 times a month, giving you a class-conscious, truly international perspective on everything from political theory to current events and internet culture. Link below. Now, let's get into the video. The oldest talking point in the anti-socialist book is, if you're poor and you're a socialist, you're just jealous. But if you're rich and you're a socialist, well, you're a hypocrite. Champagne socialist or welfare queen, your position in capitalism as you begin to propose an alternative to the current economic model was always going to put you in the crosshairs of intentionally bad actors, the super wealthy and the governments represent them, or the ignorant who are willing to do anything just to excuse away their lack of class consciousness. This age-old gotcha hasn't simply remained in the past either. It's as zoomer as it gets. Socialist agitators owning nice things immediately gets them lambasted by people who confuse making money from your own labor in capitalism versus doing so on the backs of others. Now, I can go on and on about how making money from capitalists to shit on capitalism is awesome, but that's not what this video is about. Do check out the Patreon though. No. We're here to look at the idea of having wealth, of coming from wealth, being depicted as incompatible with developing a realistic view on the inadequacies of the current system. Basically, can people who come from privilege, or even people who themselves exploit others, understand that the way we're running things right now simply sucks? And why is this important? Just so that I can feel better about making a decent living from agitating socialism, or is there something constructive to be discussed here? Well, I've heard, quote, "Everyone is a leftist until they start making good money in capitalism" a few too many times, and I would like to make sure that all of you, young or old, who managed to become an engineer, work in IT, inherit a buck from your old folks, people who are well-paid skilled laborers, academics, pilots, or architects, all of you who made something of yourselves by the very definitions of the system, those of you with a comfortable enough amount of money that you're welcome to the movement too. Right-wingers have convinced far too many that the commies are out there yearning for your house, your bed, your kids, or your toothbrush. They're not. That a $50K a year and a $300K a year American worker are somehow enemies. They're not. Your 2 cars in the driveway or a paid-off mortgage are irrelevant and don't make you incompatible with progress. Now, there are perfectly adequate arguments out there on why wealthier workers are motivated by the system itself to side with their bosses, the capitalists, over their less privileged counterparts, such as the so-called professional managerial class, your corporate mid-management Joe being both ideologically and materially pushed to quite literally make money by helping grow these exploitative structures while ignoring their own exploitation. Or the more radical perspective that all workers in the developed world are pretty much labor aristocracy, for their standards would not be achievable without the hyper-exploitation of the third world's labor and resources. And while these points are perfectly adequate systematic analyses of why so many more privileged workers tend to support the status quo, it would be plain stupid to turn away those among them who, even after all that capitalist and conservative brain rot, managed to hold progressive political views. It's plain impressive to advocate for socialism when you literally have more to lose than your chains. As you'll see in the rest of the video, people, some of whom have had more wealth than you can possibly imagine getting in your lifetime, with every excuse under the sky to go down a path of apathy and self-obsession, greed, and the never-ending thirst for more, were some of the greatest representatives and even forefathers of the anti-capitalist movement. So, how do people like that even come to be? How does one rid themselves of their cultural class bias? Well, you can at the very least start by addressing where you get information from and what kind of agenda stands behind it. This is where the sponsor of today's video, Ground News, comes into play. They're an app and a website that gathers related news articles from diverse sources to show different perspectives on the same story, with a quick visual breakdown of a news source's political bias, factuality, and ownership, so you can understand how these factors influence their reporting. Take this story on CEOs getting a hefty pay rise in 2023, widening the gap with the workers they oversee as an example. With Ground News, I can quickly catch up on the story from different perspectives based on more than 60 articles Ground News found covering this. I can also see it's been barely covered by right-leaning news sources, so there's a chance you missed the story if right-wing media is all you interact with. GN-rated left-leaning Capital in Maine reports CEO compensation skyrockets while workers' pay barely keeps up, while centrist Barron's writes shareholders are okay with soaring executive pay. Same story, totally different interpretation. Without Ground News and access to multiple perspectives, the core of this story could have been lost to you and me. That's why I also follow my most important topics like the upcoming 2024 elections or the war in Gaza, which create a personalized news feed so I can stay fully informed of the news at all times. And you can do that too. Start seeing the bigger picture today and go to ground.news/Ugopnik or scan my QR code to get a more well-rounded view of complex issues. Use my link to get 40% off the same limited access Vantage plan I use and support an independent platform, keeping the news transparent for us while supporting the channel. Thank you, Ground News, and now back to the video. Working people have class traders, but so do the capitalists. Just the latter actually contribute to something. So, let's start with the most famous among them. Engels, the co-parent of modern socialist thought. Friedrich Engels was born in 1820 in Barmen, part of the Kingdom of Prussia, now Germany. He hailed from a prosperous capitalist family deeply embedded in the industrial sector. Although Engels showed a keen interest in literature and philosophy from a young age, he left grammar school at 17 due to his father's insistence that he joins the family business. He began an apprenticeship in Bremen, where he continued to explore his philosophical interests, particularly the works of Hegel, which were popular in Germany at the time. He spent most of his time in Berlin, attending lectures and associating with the young Hegelians. During this period, he wrote poetry and social commentary, often under a pseudonym, and his growing interest in atheism strained his relationship with his devout Protestant parents. At this stage, Engels was a typical member of the German wealthy intelligentsia, sympathetic to the issues arising from industrialization, but not yet fully radicalized. Think upper-class white liberal Americans. Engels, I guess, was a white American liberal when adjusted to inflation, I guess. To curb his increasing radical views and integrate him more in the family business, his father sent him to work at the Victoria Mill, a factory in Salford in Manchester that produced sewing equipment. On his way to England, Engels met Karl Marx himself in Cologne, and the two became friends, bonding over their mutual interest in Hegelian philosophy and the impacts of industrialization. Contrary to what his dad hoped for, though, Salford and Manchester only intensified his more radical perspectives. The region, a hub of the British Empire's industrial activities, exposed him to severe poverty and pollution due to a rapid industrialization. The deplorable conditions of the working class deeply shocked Engels, who had previously lived a very sheltered and comfortable life. Engels documented his observations in vivid detail, describing the overcrowded and chaotic construction of housing, the lack of sanitation, and the prevalence of child labor. Particularly alarming to Engels was the stark disparity between the living conditions of the working class and the affluent, like himself. He concluded that the working class had been dehumanized, reduced to mere cogs in the industrial machine. Quote, "In truth, they, the working class, were not human beings. They were merely toiling machines in the service of the new aristocrats who had guided history down to that time. The Industrial Revolution has simply carried this out to its logical end by making the workers' machines pure and simple, taking from them the last trace of independent activity, and so forcing them to think and demand a position worthy of men." These experiences solidified Engels' perspective. He began to distance himself from aristocrats and industrialists, instead forming relationships with working-class individuals who left lasting impressions on him, while using his money and privilege to uplift them. Around this time, Engels met Mary Burns, an Irish working-class woman. Talk about a brilliant combination. The two developed a close relationship, with Burns acting as a guide to the worst aspects of poverty in England. The relationship, lasting 20 years, saw Burns showing Engels around England, deepening his understanding of working-class struggles. Her sudden death at 41 deeply affected Engels, who rarely mentioned her in his later years. By this time, Engels had become a committed radical. He maintained correspondence with Marx, visiting him in Paris, Brussels, and London. Together, they collaborated on numerous projects and helped establish communism as a political movement. Engels, this rich boy, which we presume was so incompatible with the socialist idea, ended up funding Marx through pretty much the entirety of that period of his life, and de facto funded Marxism itself. He didn't only contribute financially either. As a brilliant theoretician, he earned himself the position of one of the most influential socialists in history. His so-called radical activities earned him the ire of European authorities, leading to constant surveillance by Victorian officials. He and Marx lived together until Marx's death. After Engels died 10 years later, it was revealed that he was quite wealthy, with an estate estimated at around £3 million adjusted to inflation, a hefty sum, especially knowing he had spent so much of his money on funding the socialist cause. Engels' support for socialism, despite his capitalist background, is the ultimate example of choosing to look past your inherent biases, to open yourself to the true source of your family's wealth, to your privilege, to your very understanding of the world. In Engels, we have an example almost poetic in nature that even those most deeply linked to the continuation of this barbaric system can see past its manipulations and not only stand against it, but be the flag bearer. If Engels could see past his bias and privilege, so can anyone. Fidel Castro, the Cuban revolutionary, was born out of wedlock. His dad was Angel Castro, a very rich man. Angel was born in Spain to poor peasant parents. He fought in the Spanish military in his teens. He served in Cuba during the Second War of Independence and eventually even moved there. Arriving to a new land, he initially worked in the nickel mines before eventually working for the controversial United Fruit Company. Yes, Fidel's dad worked for that death squad banana firm. Later, he started his own business, selling lemonade, setting up a shop, and running a restaurant. In 1914, Angel began a wood-cutting business and purchased 200 acres of land. He developed a prosperous farm, which included various facilities and buildings, including a school, store, and bakery. Angel married in 1911 and had 5 kids. After his marriage collapsed, he took Lina Ruz Gonzalez, a maid in his household, as his partner, and they had several children, including Fidel Castro. Angel was known for his business acumen and sometimes harsh treatment of workers, though he was kind to his children and family. The two are obviously not related. By the 1950s, Angel was a wealthy man with assets equivalent to about $5.7 million in 2023. Despite his success, he harbored resentment towards American capitalism due to its role in Cuba's history. He passed away at the age of 80, just before Fidel's revolutionary activities intensified. Fidel, a boy now turned into a man, had a small empire to return to, his father's empire. But due to his rebellious nature, his short but important experience as what was then defined as a bastard born out of wedlock to a maid mother, his anti-imperialist attitudes and decent education turned Fidel away from returning to his father's business and pursuing a simple life of leisure and corporate growth. Instead, he took up arms and helped lead the Cuban Revolution. Another example of a man setting aside incredible privilege, who, just like Engels, chose to not blindly support the wrong side of history for comfort and basic ecstatic ignorance. Now, I don't want to only fill this list with super famous socialists either, so let's talk about the mass industrialist who radically, for his time, coined the phrase 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. He was a Welsh manufacturer and social reformer renowned for his advocacy of utopian socialism. His innovative practices at New Lanark Mills in Scotland, which integrated social and industrial welfare programs, drew attention from political leaders, social reformers, and even royalty. Owen was the sixth of 7 children in a family where his father was the postmaster of Newton. He left school at the age of 10 to apprentice with a clothes maker where he had access to a rich library. By age of 19, Owen had become the superintendent at a large cotton mill in Manchester, developing it into a leading establishment in Great Britain. He later persuaded his partners to purchase the New Lanark Mills. New Lanark housed 2,000 people, including 500 children from poorhouses. Owen improved living conditions, emphasizing order, cleanliness, and thrift at a time where letting employees literally collapse from work and their own feces was common policy. He opened a store selling quality goods at no profit. In 1816, he founded the first infant school in Great Britain, focusing on character development and including activities like dancing and music. His reforms earned him the trust of the community, especially when he paid workers during a closure caused by the War of 1812. Later on, in spite of some of his partner's objections to the cost of his more ethical treatment of employees, Owen simply formed a new firm with like-minded investors, continuing his progressive work. Owen's 1813 essay, A New View of Society, outlined his belief that human character is shaped by circumstances beyond individual control. He argued for placing people under proper influence from early childhood to develop their character. His work in New Lanark garnered national and European attention, showcasing the positive effects of his educational and social reforms. Most famously, in the early 19th century, Robert Owen raised the demand for a 10-hour day in 1810. Crazier back then than a 4-day work week is today. Not only that, but he put it in practice at his so-called socialist enterprises at New Lanark. By 1817, he had formulated the goal of the 8-hour workday and coined the slogan, 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. Some of you might be saying, well, that's the minimum. And, well, it is. But thanks to men like himself. Thought leaders who literally lost money as capitalists, as owners of said factories. He put his own moral beliefs, informed by the material world he witnessed, ahead of his personal finances. So if owning a whole-ass factory was not enough privilege to keep his eyes closed to the suffering of the thousands around him, then what's your excuse? Now, I can go through personal histories of plenty of other capitalist class traders or wealthy people who decided to side against the status quo, but this would turn into a whole-ass biographical documentary if it already kind of hasn't. So, let me shoot you some of my favorites, maybe the more privileged among you might identify with. Maybe a guy you heard of, Mao Zedong. His dad was a literal ultra-rich Monsanto-level farmer and landowner. To top it off, he was a money lender, so an old bank or loan shark, whichever you prefer. Mao ended up doing, things to moneylenders and landlords throughout his revolution. Or another one, Kropotkin, the dad of anarchism, was a literal antithesis to all that anarchism stands to protect. An aristocrat from a powerful land-owning family. Like, my dude didn't even come from capitalists. He came from a feudal family where his dad literally owned serfs, owned human beings. And you're out here thinking that you're on the same side with billionaires because you bought, a Mustang? And it doesn't even have to be people who were dead long before we were born. Here's one for us Zoomers. Yes, I'm claiming it. I'm claiming the Zoomer. Please have me. The millennials are still wearing fucking skinny jeans. Ludwig, that streamer guy.
I got some big news, because today I sold my company and I made $2. Let me explain. I made this company a year ago called Off-Brand, and the goal was to make cool events for creators, which is exactly what we did. We made this event for Doug, and we also produced a Streamer Award. So why did I sell it, and why did I only make $2? And to answer that question, I have to show you who I sold the company to. It's all these people right here. Those are the employees at Off-Brand, the people who get the work done, who produce events and talk to game devs and everything in between. And I sold them all my ownership for literally pennies. So now it's employee owned. It's also known as a co-op. Basically, the people who work at the company get to make the decisions on what happens with the company. And I still work there. I just don't own everything, and I can't sell the company to like Amazon for millions of dollars later on. And don't get me wrong, money's cool, but I feel like when you've made enough to spend $4,000 on a tungsten cube without batting an eye, you're pretty set. And what matters a lot more to me is making a company that people love to work at and hopefully will last long after I'm gone.
This dude isn't even a socialist, yet he gets it. So what are you even waiting for? In conclusion, I don't think I can outdo a bunch of industrialists, a streamer, aristocrats, a daddy's boy, and the son of a loan shark as examples to why even the greatest debts of privilege shouldn't be used as an excuse for continuing to wave away other people's suffering. Or, in contrast, for those of you less privileged, to not see the great value people who might not have gone through the same level of suffering as you can bring. You see, we all start the game of life differently. Our paths then proceed to bounce off of the material reality we find ourselves in as we get molded into something completely different. All we can hope for is that we like who we end up seeing in the mirror. So, wherever life has taken you now, the lowest gutters or the highest of palaces, standing idly as empire, as capital, this eternally hungry, self-replicating system swallows us whole, will leave you soulless, purposeless, and forgotten by history. Because deep down, but really deep down, no matter your levels of privilege, you can't stop your heart from screaming the obvious truth. This cannot go on. Thank you for watching. If you made it to the end of the video, that means you'll probably be interested in the live stream segment of what I do here. Check out the links below and join me over on Twitch, or watch the highlights over on my Ugopnik live channel. Now, it's time to thank all my wonderful patrons without whom none of this would be possible. Especially
Rivoluzione,